was still hot when my son-in-law called. I remember that detail clearly because I'd just sat down in my recliner, the old brown one my wife picked out before she passed, and I was finally letting myself rest. 63 years old, and my knees remind me every morning that I'm not the man I used to be. I'd been on my feet since 6, fixing a leaky pipe under the kitchen sink, and all I wanted was 20 quiet minutes with my coffee and the morning news. Then my phone buzzed on the side table. I looked at the screen. It was my son in law, Philip, my daughter Renee's husband. I picked up. Hey, are you home right now? His voice was rushed, a little strained, not unusual for him. Philip always sounded like he was running slightly behind on something. I told him I was. I've got a situation, he said. I have to fly to Portland tonight. Client emergency. My whole team's going. We might be there 4 or 5 days. He paused. I need someone to watch Eli. Eli, my grandson, 8 years old. I said, of course. I didn't even think twice. Eli was my daughter's boy, which made him my blood, regardless of what I thought about the man on the other end of the phone. And honestly, I enjoyed the kid's company. He was a quiet boy, thoughtful, liked to sit beside me when I watched baseball and ask questions about players I hadn't thought about in 30 years. Philip said he'd drop him off by 7 that evening. I said, fine. I didn't ask where Renee was. I should have. Looking back, that's the question I should have asked the moment he called. But I assumed she was working, or busy, or that there was some ordinary explanation I didn't need spelled out. Philip and I weren't close. We were polite to each other at holidays and birthdays, and that was about the extent of it. I never fully warmed up to him. Something about the way he spoke over Renee at the dinner table, the way he answered questions she hadn't asked him, but I kept those feelings to myself. He was her husband. She was a grown woman. It wasn't my place. Eli arrived at 7:15. Philip pulled into the driveway, and Eli got out of the passenger side carrying a backpack that looked barely half full. He had on a long-sleeved shirt despite the fact that it was 68 degrees outside. Philip didn't get out of the car. He rolled the window down and said, he's got 2 days of clothes in there. There's a number for his school on his phone if anything comes up. Then he looked at Eli and said, be good, and drove away. That was it. No hug, no goodbye, just be good and reverse out of the driveway. I put my hand on Eli's shoulder and walked him inside. I made him a grilled cheese sandwich and some tomato soup because it was what I always made him when he was little, and he always used to tear through it. I set the bowl and the plate in front of him and got myself a glass of water and sat across from him. He stared at the food, just sat there looking at it like he was waiting for something. I thought maybe he wasn't hungry. Maybe he'd eaten on the way over. I said, you doing okay, bud? He looked up at me. Then he looked back at the bowl. I said, you don't have to eat it if you're not hungry. He looked up again, and his voice was so small it barely made it across the table. He said, am I allowed to eat it? I felt something shift in my chest. A cold, quiet kind of dread that I didn't fully understand yet. I said, what do you mean allowed? Of course you're allowed. I made it for you. He picked up the spoon. His hands were shaking a little. He took one spoonful of soup and then looked at me again, like he was checking to make sure I still meant it. I said, go ahead, Eli, eat. And he did. He ate the whole bowl and the whole sandwich, and when I asked if he wanted more, he nodded without looking up. I made him a second grilled cheese. He ate that too. I didn't say much. I just watched him and tried to keep my face from showing what was happening in my head. After dinner, I showed him to the guest room. It was the same room Renee used to sleep in when she was a teenager. Same pale yellow walls, same twin bed with the quilt my mother made. Eli set his backpack down and sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the quilt like he was memorizing the pattern of it. I told him I'd leave the hall light on. I said goodnight. He said goodnight back. I went to my own room and I sat on the edge of my bed and I thought about what he'd said. Am I allowed to eat it? 8 years old, asking permission to eat a meal. I didn't sleep much that night. The next morning I was up before him. I made scrambled eggs and toast and orange juice and set it all out on the kitchen table. When Eli came downstairs, already dressed, he stopped in the doorway and looked at the table. That's for you, I said. Sit down. He sat. He ate. Again, he looked at me after each bite at first, like the permission might expire. By the time he got to the toast, he'd relaxed a little, and I could see something in his face that looked almost like relief. The kind of relief that should never be on an 8-year-old's face over a plate of scrambled eggs. I sat across from him with my coffee. I said, "How's school going?" He shrugged. "Okay. You got a favorite subject?" He thought about it. "Art, I guess. We did clay stuff last week." "Yeah? What do you make?" "A bowl." He almost smiled. It was kind of lopsided. "First ones always are," I said. We sat quietly for a minute. Then I said, "Ellie, can I ask you something? You don't have to answer if you don't want to." He looked up. "Last night, when I put the food in front of you, you asked if you were allowed to eat it. What did you mean by that?" He looked down at his plate. I said, "I'm not in trouble and neither are you. I just want to understand." He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Sometimes at home I have to ask. If I eat without asking, Dad gets really mad." I kept my voice even. I said, "What happens when he gets mad?" Ely didn't answer that. He just picked up his toast and looked out the window at the backyard. I didn't push him, but I filed it away in a place in my mind I couldn't ignore. Later that morning, I asked him if he wanted to go to the pub down the street, the one with the creek that runs behind the baseball diamond. He nodded and went to get his jacket from his backpack. He pulled out a blue hoodie and I noticed something before he got it on. A mark on his upper arm. I didn't say anything. I didn't make him feel seen in a way that would scare him back into silence. I just held the door open and we walked to the park. But I was already a different man than I'd been the day before. Something had shifted in me. Some old protective instinct that I thought had quieted down with age. And it was back, and it was fully away. At the park, he ran ahead to the creek and started looking for crawdads under the rocks. I sat on a bench and watched him, and I thought about my daughter. Renee had been gone for 14 months. Cancer. She was 41 years old, pancreatic. She lasted 4 months after the diagnosis, and I still wake up sometimes expecting to hear her voice. And then remember, you don't really get used to it. You just learn where to step around it. Philip had custody of Eli. That was never contested because there was no one to contest it. I was just a grandfather. I had no legal standing, no paperwork, no claim. I showed up at holidays and took Eli for weekend visits when Philip allowed it, which was not always when I asked. I assumed Philip was grieving too in his own way, and I gave him room. I told myself the boy was fine. I told myself I would know if something was wrong. I didn't know. I hadn't known at all. When we got back from the park, I asked Eli if he wanted to watch a movie. He said sure. I let him pick. He chose something animated, sat on the couch beside me, and fell asleep within 20 minutes. He was out so deeply that when I shifted to get up, he didn't even stir. While he slept, I went to the kitchen and called my neighbor Beverly. She'd worked for Child Protective Services for over 20 years before she retired, and I trusted her more than almost anyone. I told her what had happened, the question at the dinner table, the way he ate, the mark on his arm. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Have you taken any photos?" I hadn't. She said, "If you see it again, document it. And listen, don't confront the father yet. Don't give him a reason to take that boy back before you have anything on record." I asked her what I should do. "Call the school," she said. "Not to report yet, just to ask how he's been doing. Teachers see things. If there's a pattern, they'll have noticed. And if they're not talking, it might be because no one's asked them directly." I thanked her. I hung up and stood in my kitchen for a long time listening to the sound of the animated movie coming from the living room and the sound of my grandson breathing in his sleep. Monday morning, I drove Eli to school. It was a 40-minute drive because Philip lived across town and Eli was enrolled in the district there. When we pulled up, Eli grabbed his backpack and then turned to look at me. He said, "Are you picking me up?" I said yes. He nodded, like that was the most important piece of information he'd received all day. Then he got out and walked toward the front doors without looking back, the way kids do when they're trying to seem okay. I sat in the parking lot for a few minutes. Then I went inside. I asked the front office if I could speak with Eli's teacher. They said she had a prep period in about an hour, and could I wait? I said I could. Her name was Miss Kwan. She was maybe late 30s, small, with reading glasses pushed up on her head. She came out to the waiting area and shook my hand, and we went to sit in a little conference room off the main office. I told her I was Eli's maternal grandfather. I told her his mother had passed. I told her I had had Eli for the weekend and I'd noticed some things that concerned me, and I wanted to know if she had noticed anything at school. She folded her hands on the table. She said, "How honest can I be with you?" I said, "Please." She told me that Eli had been coming to school without lunch for the better part of 3 months. At first, she assumed he'd forgotten it, or that it was sporadic. But it happened almost every day, and when the cafeteria offered him a tray, he sometimes ate so fast he made himself sick. She said she'd started keeping granola bars in her desk specifically for him. She said she'd filled out a concern form through the district 3 weeks ago and had not heard back. She said she hadn't known whom to call. She hadn't been sure whether his father would be responsive or whether it would make things worse for Eli at home. She said she felt stuck, and she said it like someone who'd been carrying the weight of that feeling for a while. I told her I understood. I thanked her. When I got back to my truck, I sat in the parking lot and put both hands on the steering wheel and breathed. Then I called my old friend Dennis. Retired cop, still had friends on the force, and I asked him who I needed to talk to. I'm not going to pretend the next few days moved quickly, because they didn't. These things don't move quickly. I made calls, I wrote down everything I'd witnessed in a notepad, with dates and times and exact words. I took a photograph on Wednesday morning when I helped Eli change into pajamas and saw the bruising more clearly. 2 distinct marks on his upper left arm. Old enough to be fading, but still visible. I documented it. I sent a copy to Dennis. I called the state child abuse hotline and made a formal report. Philip came back on Friday evening. He texted me that he was on his way. I had Eli's bag packed, and Eli beside me on the couch, and I was trying to keep my voice normal when I told Eli his dad was coming. Eli's face didn't change the way a kid's face changes when they're excited to see a parent. It closed. Just went very still and quiet. I said, "Hey, look at me." He looked up. I said, "Whatever happens, you can call me. Day or night, you know my number." He nodded. I said, "Say it." He said my number back to me without hesitating. He'd known it since he was 5. Renee had made sure of that. Philip came to the door. I answered it before he could knock. We stood there for a moment. I looked at him, and he looked at me, and I think something in my face told him this was not going to be the same conversation we usually had. He said, "Hey, how'd he do?" I said, "He did fine. Can we talk for a minute before he comes out?" Philip's expression shifted slightly. He said, "Okay." I told him what I'd seen. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse him of anything directly. I just told him what Eli had said at the dinner table, what Miss Kwan had told me, what I'd noticed. I told him I'd already made a report to CPS. His face went through several things in about 10 seconds. Surprise, then anger, then something that looked almost like shame, and then a kind of shutting down that I recognized. A man putting his walls back up. He said, "You had no right to do that." I said, "He's my grandson, and you're not feeding him." Philip left with Eli that night. There was nothing I could do to stop that. No court order, no custody arrangement that gave me any standing. I watched my grandson get into the back of that car, and I watched it pull out of my driveway, and I went back inside and I sat at my kitchen table and I put my face in my hands. But I had made the report. It was on record, and that meant it couldn't be undone. The CPS investigation took 3 weeks. I gave my statement. Ms. Kwan gave hers. A caseworker spoke with Eli. I was told he spoke openly, the way kids sometimes do when someone finally asks them a direct question in a safe room with no one watching. During those 3 weeks, I called every family law attorney I could find in my area. I learned that as a grandparent in this state, I could petition for visitation rights, and under certain circumstances involving documented abuse, I could petition for custody. I had never filed a legal document in my life outside of my taxes and my wife's estate. I found an attorney named Miss Okafor who worked out of a small office downtown, and she was patient with me and she told me what I needed and what I could realistically expect. I cashed in part of my retirement savings, $12,000. I want to be honest about that because I know people wonder how these things get paid for. I was on a fixed income, social security, and a small pension from 30 years in the trades. 12,000 was not nothing. It was a year and a half of savings. But there was no version of this where I didn't spend that money. The CPS investigation substantiated the report. There was evidence of food deprivation and physical discipline that exceeded legal standards. Philip was required to attend parenting classes and anger management. Eli was placed with me on a temporary emergency basis while the case moved through the court system. The first night Eli was back in my house officially, with a court order behind it, I made dinner. Pork chops, mashed potatoes, green beans, nothing fancy. I set the plate in front of him and sat down across from him, and he looked at the food and then looked at me and then picked up his fork. He didn't ask permission. I had to look down at my own plate for a moment because I didn't want him to see my face. The custody hearing happened over 2 days. I was not a dramatic person. I didn't make speeches. I sat in the courtroom in the suit I'd worn to Renee's funeral, and I answered the questions my attorney asked, and I told the truth. Philip's attorney argued that this was a case of misunderstanding, of a father under stress after losing his wife, of grief manifesting in ways that were regrettable but not criminal. There was some truth in that, I'll admit. The therapist who'd evaluated Philip testified that he had significant unresolved trauma from his own childhood. His father had been a hard man, the kind of hard that leaves marks. Philip had never been taught another way. That explanation didn't excuse what happened to Eli. It didn't fix the 3 months my grandson went to school without lunch. But I sat in that courtroom and I listened and I tried to hold both things, the wrong that was done and the broken history behind it, without letting either one cancel out the other. The judge awarded me primary physical custody of Eli with supervised visitation for Philip contingent on his continued participation in therapy and parenting classes. She also addressed the question of child support directly. The court ordered Philip to pay $420 a month toward Eli's care. I want to be clear about that because it mattered. It wasn't a fortune, but it meant I wasn't doing this entirely alone. The judge asked Eli before she ruled where he felt safe. He said, "At my grandpa's." That was only said 3 words. I still hear them. Eli has been with me for 7 months now. He eats breakfast every morning without asking. He's back in art class and he showed me a ceramic mug he made. Less lopsided than the bowl, he told me very seriously. And I keep it on the counter next to the coffee maker. He has nightmares sometimes, and I've learned to listen for the particular sound of his bedroom door and to just be in the hallway when he opens it. Not saying much, just being there. He's in therapy twice a week. His therapist is a soft-spoken man named Dr. Aldridge, who works with kids who've been through hard things. And Eli seems to like him, or at least he tolerates him, which at 8 years old is probably the same thing. Philip calls on the scheduled days. Their conversations are short and sometimes awkward, but Eli picks up the phone. He doesn't hang up angry. I think that's something. Philip is still in therapy. I don't know what's happening in those sessions. I don't need to. What I need is for my grandson to grow up knowing that the people who are supposed to protect him will actually do it. I'm 63 years old. My knees hurt in the morning, and my coffee goes cold faster than it used to, and I have a third grader asleep down the hall who is going to lead me to stay healthy and present for a long time yet. I'm going to stay healthy and present for a long time yet. After Renee died, I thought the best of my life was behind me, that I was in the long quiet stretch at the end, just filling in the days until I ran out of them. I was wrong about that. It turns out I was being asked to do the most important thing I've ever done. It turns out my daughter left someone behind who needed me, and I almost didn't see it because I was being too polite. I think about that a lot. About how close I came to driving Eli home that Friday night and never saying a word. About how a different version of me might have told himself it wasn't his business, that Philip was a father, that it was complicated family stuff, and who was I to interfere? I don't know that version of myself, and I don't want to. Some things are your business. Some things you don't get to walk away from just because walking away is easier. If you love someone, you pay attention. You notice the long sleeve shirt in 68-degree weather. You notice the hands that shake before the first bite. You notice, and then you do not look away. I still think about the moment Eli picked up that spoon for the second time. Not the first time, when his hands were shaking, but the second time, after I told him to go ahead and he finally believed me. There was nothing dramatic about it. He just ate. But I understood, sitting across that kitchen table from him, that something had been broken in that boy in a way that a bowl of soup couldn't fix. And I also understood that the breaking had happened slowly, quietly, in a house where no one was watching closely enough. Including me. That's the part I have to live with. I was his grandfather. I loved him. And I still almost missed it. I told myself Philip was grieving. I told myself it wasn't my place. I told myself a grown woman's husband was none of my business, and when that grown woman died, I just transferred that same politeness to a son situation and I called it respect. It wasn't respect. It was the easier thing dressed up in a reasonable sounding word. What I know now, what those 7 months of raising Eli have taught me at 63 years old, when I thought my teaching days were behind me, is that the people we love require us to pay attention. Not polite, surface level attention. Real attention. The kind that notices a long sleeve shirt on a warm evening. The kind that hears what a child means, not just what he says. Eli didn't say, "My dad doesn't feed me." He said, "Am I allowed to eat?" And I almost let it pass. I almost nodded and handed him another sandwich and told myself kids say strange things sometimes. That kind of attention, the real kind, takes something from you. It takes honesty, the willingness to see what's actually in front of you instead of what's easier to believe. It takes the courage to act on what you see, even when acting means conflict, means lawyers, means spending money you were saving for a quieter version of your old age. Philip's father never gave him that kind of attention either. He was given hardness instead of guidance, punishment instead of patience, and he passed it on the only way he knew how because nobody had ever shown him another way. That's not an excuse, but it's a cause. Things happen for reasons, even terrible things, and understanding the reason doesn't mean you accept the result. What breaks the chain is someone who decides to see clearly and then act on what they see, not someone extraordinary. Just someone who is honest enough to admit the situation is serious and stubborn enough to do something about it anyway. Miss Kwan kept granola bars in her desk for 3 months because she couldn't figure out who to call. I was the person she'd been waiting for, and I almost didn't show up. Ili is 8 years old, and he's learning, slowly, that meals are not something to be earned, that sleep is not a reward, that the people in his life will be there in the morning. I am learning at 63 that love without attention is just a feeling, and feelings without action don't protect anyone. The most important things I've ever done in my life have required me to be honest, to think clearly even when I was afraid, and to keep going when it would have been much simpler to stop. I don't have any grand conclusions. I just know that my grandson's ceramic mug sits next to my coffee maker. And every morning when I reach past it to pour my coffee, I remember what it cost to get it there. And I'd pay it again without hesitating.